One Saturday afternoon, my wife and I were lounging on the living room couch, basking in that rare, unhurried weekend calm. The TV played some forgettable sitcom as we sipped coffee, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. We hadn't had a quiet moment together like this in ages, each of us so often pulled in a million directions. Even now, she had her phone in hand, scrolling away, though a relaxed smile spread across her face. Then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, and Brian flashed on the screen. Brian, my longtime business partner, someone who'd been by my side since I started this whole thing. We owned the company together, but everyone knew who really ran it. It was me, the boss, handling the clients, the staff, the bottom line. Brian was a great friend and a steady partner, but the day-to-day was my responsibility. So a weekend call from him was unusual. "Hey man," I answered, curious. He jumped right in, his voice full of that familiar, easy excitement. "Just wanted to invite you both to a little party tomorrow night," he said, a rare warmth in his tone. Kind of a celebration for the baby. Ellie was just born yesterday. Brian had been over the moon about becoming a father. They'd struggled with fertility for years, and Ellie was his miracle, their long-awaited blessing. I hadn't heard him this happy in a long time, and I was genuinely thrilled for him. "Absolutely, we'll be there," I said, casting a glance at my wife, whose interest had piqued the moment she heard party. I could feel her anticipation practically radiating off her. "Congratulations, man. We'll celebrate tomorrow. Thanks for inviting us." After I hung up, I barely got a word out before she was up, eyes gleaming. "We're going?" she asked, voice brimming with enthusiasm. I hadn't seen her this excited in ages. She used to love parties, but somewhere along the way, the thrill had faded. It had been years since we'd gone out together like this. Maybe it was marriage or maybe just life, but her eagerness for anything outside of our usual routine had dulled. Now, she was practically glowing, and I couldn't help but smile at her reaction. "We're going," I confirmed. "Oh, I need something to wear," she said, half to herself, already halfway down the hall and toward her closet. She started rifling through dresses, pulling them out one by one, mumbling about needing to find something perfect. I stood there for a moment, watching her delight in the search, realizing how much I'd missed this side of her. She had always been striking, a woman who could command any room without even trying. But over the past few years, we'd fallen into a routine, and that vibrancy had faded just a little around the edges. Now it was back, and she was completely in her element again, tossing aside dress after dress in a frantic hunt for the perfect one. "I want to look stunning," she called out to me, a playful sparkle in her eye. My wife was in full pre-party mode, rummaging through her closet with a level of commitment I hadn't seen in ages. Dress after dress flew out of her closet and onto the bed as she mumbled to herself, holding each one up to the light and eyeing it critically. I found myself watching with a mix of amusement and admiration. For the first time in what felt like years, she seemed genuinely excited, caught up in something beyond our daily routines. It was nice, refreshing, even as she spun around to try on a new dress. My phone buzzed again. "Brian." I answered it immediately, curious. "Hey man, one more thing," he said, sounding slightly out of breath, like he'd been running around his house getting everything ready. "I forgot to mention the time. Show up around noon. All right? We got a big crowd coming, lots of folks from work and some potential clients. It's going to be more of a day thing. Good for schmoozing?" "Got it, noon it is," I replied, nodding along even though he couldn't see me. I glanced over at my wife, who was now mid-spin, admiring herself in the mirror. "See you then, and thanks again for inviting us." I barely hung up before I heard her call out, "What do you think, the red or the black?" Her voice was muffled by fabric, and she emerged from the closet holding up two very different, yet equally striking dresses. I gave her an appreciative nod. The black's classic, but the red, definitely the red, I decided, picturing her in it. The selection process continued, though. Shoes, accessories, a slew of decisions. I wasn't sure if she even noticed, but by the time she finally had her outfit sorted, I'd already checked my email, scrolled through the news, and almost dozed off. It was approaching an hour when I heard the faint buzz of her phone. I glanced down at the screen. Alex Berberg. The name meant nothing to me, and that was strange. Over the years, We'd both gotten familiar with each other's circles, and she hadn't mentioned an Alex before. With a slight hesitation, I got up and walked her phone over to the bedroom. She'd mentioned Brian inviting a bunch of friends and business contacts, so maybe Alex was some new acquaintance through that. "Someone named Alex is calling you," I said, handing her the phone. She looked at the screen, her expression shifting just slightly, almost like she was caught off guard. She took the phone from me and gave a quick, tight smile before stepping out of the room. I stayed where I was, straining to catch snippets of the conversation, but she had already lowered her voice, speaking softly, her words little more than a murmur. Finally, a few fragments floated back to me, faint but clear enough to make me pause. "Yes, yes, I'll be there tomorrow. At 12, of course," she said, her voice smooth and measured. There was a small pause, a soft laugh that felt strangely out of place. She ended the call and walked back in, her expression composed but with a hint of something behind her eyes. Excitement, maybe? I couldn't quite place it, but something about it made me uncomfortable. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone as light as I could. She gave me a small, dismissive smile. "Just an acquaintance. Someone you'll meet tomorrow. Brian knows him well." Her answer felt incomplete, as though she was glossing over something. But she seemed so casual, so at ease, that I didn't press it. Maybe I was overthinking it. We'd be at the party tomorrow, and then I'd meet this mysterious Alex and all would make sense. But as she turned back to her reflection, making a final adjustment to her outfit, I couldn't shake the slight gnawing feeling in my chest. A strange feeling that something about all this, the excitement, the secrecy, the new name, the party, was about to set us on a path I hadn't anticipated. The next day, she looked incredible. She wore a black dress that shimmered in the light and fit her perfectly, accentuating every detail I'd admired from the beginning. Her hair fell in soft waves, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. It was the same feeling I had when we'd first met, a heady mix of admiration and disbelief that someone like her had chosen to be with me. Watching her move with such effortless elegance, I felt a surge of pride and something deeper, a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. As we pulled up to Brian's house, the scene was just as lively as I'd expected. Cars packed his driveway and lined the street, gleaming under the midday sun, each more expensive than the last. The party was in full swing, laughter and music spilling out from every open window. It was an impressive gathering. Brian had really pulled out all the stops, and I knew this party wasn't just about celebrating the birth of his daughter. It was also a chance for everyone in our circle to mingle, to show off a bit, and to make connections. The moment we walked in, people greeted me from all sides, clapping me on the back and congratulating Brian too. It was like I just entered a second home. Almost every face was familiar, from other CEOs to partners, all the movers and shakers we'd done business with over the years. As I scanned the room, I saw the admiration on my wife's face as she looked around, taking in the crowd with a certain glint in her that only showed up in moments like this. Brian spotted us from across the room and hurried over, his face beaming with pride. "You made it," he exclaimed, pulling me in for a hug and then turning to my wife with equal enthusiasm. After handing him a carefully chosen gift, I pulled him aside, a question lingering in my mind since the previous day. "Hey, do you know someone named Alex Berberg?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, but my curiosity barely contained. Brian gave me a knowing nod and a little laugh. "Yeah, Alex. He's a good guy. Went to school with your wife. Actually, real solid kid, hardworking too. He should be arriving soon. I'm sure they'll be happy to catch up." He said it so easily, as if it was obvious that she would know him. But the ease with which he said it took me off guard. Why had she never mentioned him before? She had talked about her school days countless times, shared stories about her friends and classmates. But Alex? He had never come up. I forced a smile, brushing it off, and clapped Brian on the shoulder. "Good to know," I replied, swallowing the uncomfortable prick of unease growing inside me. Trying to shake it off, I refocused on the party, mingling with old acquaintances and discussing the usual mix of business news and potential deals. It was easy to slip back into the rhythm of it, the conversation flowing naturally as everyone passed around drinks and congratulated Brian on his big day. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of my wife across the room, laughing, chatting with others, clearly in her element. And then I noticed the stir near the entrance as someone walked in, a young man, tall, muscular, and by the look of him, about 20 or so. He had an air about him that made him hard to ignore, and judging by the immediate attention he commanded, it seemed I wasn't the only one who noticed. Something about him struck me as out of place in this crowd, like he didn't belong here among the executives and business types. He had an energy that was vibrant, maybe a little too much for this polished environment. My wife noticed him too. Her entire demeanor changed the moment he walked in. Without hesitation, she put her drink down and moved toward him, practically running in her heels as her eyes lit up with unmistakable excitement. There was a familiarity between them, something easy and unguarded that I hadn't seen in her interactions with anyone else all night. I watched, my stomach tightening, as she reached him. She threw her arms around him in a quick embrace, the kind reserved for someone you haven't seen in ages, but have missed all the while. He grinned down at her, saying something I couldn't quite hear, and her laugh rang out over the music. It wasn't just a friendly hello. It was something more. Not long after, I saw her walking over, that same guy in tow. She looked radiant, a gleam of excitement still in her eyes, like introducing him to me was a moment she'd been anticipating. They made their way through the crowd, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they exchanged a quiet laugh. My stomach twisted at the sight, but I forced myself to relax, convincing myself I was overreacting. When they reached me, she flashed me a wide, almost playful smile, her hand still lingering on his arm as if she'd forgotten I was even standing there. "Honey, this is Alex," she announced, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of pride. "The same Alex you asked about yesterday." He extended his hand, and I shook it, his grip firm, his eyes meeting mine without hesitation. "Nice to meet you," he said, giving a friendly nod. "Your wife's told me a lot about you." "Oh, really?" I replied, glancing over at her. She met my gaze, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe amusement, maybe something else, that made me feel like the odd one out. "I wish she'd mentioned you sooner." She laughed lightly, waving it off. "Well, we hadn't spoken in years, you know. Until recently." She said it so easily, so offhandedly, like there was nothing to explain. I wanted to ask why he hadn't come up sooner, why there were gaps in her stories I'd never noticed. But before I could say anything, she turned to him with a soft smile. "You should go say hi to Brian. He's been expecting you." He nodded, glancing back at me with a casual wave. "Good seeing you, man." Without another word, she turned and went with him, walking away as if I were some casual bystander. I watched them head off together, her hand still resting comfortably on his arm, her attention fully focused on him, oblivious to my presence. The ease between them gnawed at me, a subtle intimacy in their laughter, in the way they leaned in close to exchange words only they could hear. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It was just an old friend, and what could possibly happen here, at a crowded party surrounded by our colleagues, our friends, our business partners? I tried to push down the irritation and jealousy that was building up inside me, reminding myself that I had no reason to worry. This was just another guest, another face in the crowd, and she was simply being polite, showing him around. They probably had 100 things to catch up on. But even as I rationalized it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing something that I wasn't meant to, that there was more to this reunion than she was letting on. The laughter, the glances they exchanged, these small things stuck with me, pricking at my confidence, wearing it thin. I turned back to the crowd, trying to shake the feeling off. I reminded myself to be reasonable, to trust her. She'd simply found an old friend, and they were catching up. But as I stood there alone, watching them disappear into the crowd together, I couldn't ignore the hollow ache building in my chest. The party was in full swing, with laughter, loud music, and bursts of energy filling every corner of Brian's house. The evening was turning out to be a great time, better than I'd anticipated. I found myself slipping into the rhythm of the crowd, drink in hand, laughing and talking with friends, the familiar comfort of our world settling around me. It had been so long since we'd had a night like this, and I was determined to enjoy it. The earlier encounter with Alex, and the way my wife had disappeared with him was starting to feel like a distant memory. I kept telling myself to shake it off and just relax. At some point, I heard the familiar sound of her laugh cutting through the noise. I turned and spotted her in the middle of the crowd, swaying to the music, her eyes half closed as she let herself go. She looked breathtaking, free and alive in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Her smile was wide, her face flushed, and her movements were looser, more carefree. I felt that old, familiar pride swell in my chest, watching her let go for once, lost in the music and laughter. But then I saw her reach for a bottle, a full bottle, and lift it to her lips. She tipped her head back, taking several deep swigs, and I felt a pang of concern cut through my good mood. This wasn't like her. She was normally careful, reserved even. But tonight, it was like a different person had taken over, someone who was throwing caution to the wind. "Hey, what are you doing?" I said as I hurried over, trying to keep my tone light, but unable to mask the worry. She turned to me, her face flushed, eyes glassy with the effects of too much alcohol. She managed to smile, but her footing was unsteady, and she swayed toward me, barely able to keep her balance. "I'm just having fun," she slurred, her words trailing off into a half-hearted laugh. Maybe a little too much, I guess. It was clear she was more than tipsy, and I was hit with a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" I suggested, steadying her as she wobbled on her heels. She let out a long sigh, her expression shifting to something softer, almost apologetic. "Yeah, maybe I should." Supporting her carefully, I led her through the crowded living room, weaving through guests who either didn't notice her state or were too caught up in their own conversations to care. I steered her down the hall to a quieter area and finally found an open door. It was Brian's room, the bed neatly made, with the faintest hint of cologne lingering in the air. The noise from the party was muted here, creating a small bubble of peace in the midst of the chaos outside. "Just lie down for a bit, okay?" I said, helping her to the bed. She nodded, letting herself sink into the mattress, her eyes already drooping as she let out a slow exhale. She gave me a hazy smile, looking almost childlike in her half-drunken state. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft. "I think I just got a little too excited. It's been a long time since we've had this much fun." I brushed a strand of hair from her face and gave her a small smile, trying to push down the flicker of worry. "Just rest. I'll come back and check on you in a little while." She nodded again, her eyes drifting shut. I stayed there a moment longer, watching her breathe evenly as she lay sprawled on the bed, her hand curled lightly on the blanket. For a second, she looked so peaceful, so much like the woman I fell in love with, that I felt the night's earlier tension start to fade. Maybe this was what she needed, a night to let go, to feel free again. With one last glance, I quietly closed the door, leaving her in the quiet, hoping she'd sleep it off and rejoin the party when she felt better. But as I walked back into the crowded, lively house, a small knot of unease twisted in my stomach, one that no amount of laughter or drinks seemed able to untangle. I barely made it back to the main party, trying to settle back into conversation and push aside my worry. I was talking with one of my business partners, making small talk about the latest quarterly numbers, when a sudden hush fell over the crowd. I glanced up to see people staring, their eyes wide with shock, their mouths hanging open. And then I heard her voice. "Help me, I can't find my clothes." I turned, and there she was, my wife, stumbling out of the hallway, completely unclothed. Her face was flushed, her eyes bleary and unfocused, and she swayed unsteadily as she took a few steps into the crowd, looking around with a bewildered expression. The moment was a blur, like a nightmare playing out in slow motion. Every eye in the room was on her, and then on me. I saw Brian across the room, his face frozen in shock, a glass paused midair in his hand. My business partners, our friends, everyone was standing there, staring at her in utter disbelief, and then turning to me with judgment in their eyes. Brian's voice broke through the stunned silence, a mix of disbelief and anger. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, his voice sharp, cutting through the room. Heat rose to my face as I took in the horrified stares. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, a wave of shame and confusion threatening to knock the air out of me. I rushed to her, pulling off my jacket and wrapping it around her as quickly as I could, trying to shield her from the relentless gaze of the crowd. Her expression was dazed, as if she barely registered what was happening. She just kept looking at me with a puzzled, almost childlike expression, mumbling something incoherent as I held her close. Behind us, the whispers began. I could hear people murmuring, casting glances my way, some shaking their heads, others outright sneering. The humiliation was suffocating, every word, every stare cutting through me, making my skin prickle with shame. I grabbed her arm, steering her back down the hall to Brian's room, shutting the door behind us with a shuddering breath. The embarrassment was like a physical ache in my chest, twisting and tightening until I could barely breathe. I turned to her, my voice low but filled with fury I could barely contain. "What the hell were you thinking?" I hissed, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You just humiliated both of us in front of everyone." She looked at me, eyes still glassy, a faint smile tugging at her lips as if she didn't grasp the gravity of what had just happened. I just couldn't find my clothes," she murmured, barely able to focus. I forced myself to stay calm as I helped her into her dress, pulling the fabric over her shoulders and smoothing it down. My hands shook with anger and shame, every motion a reminder of the spectacle we'd become out there. "When we get home," I said, my voice thick with frustration, "we're going to have a serious conversation about this. Do you understand?" She only nodded, her expression unfocused, as though she hadn't even registered what I'd said. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, knowing I would have to face the crowd again. As we left the room, I hoped, somehow, that the shock would have faded, that people would have gone back to their conversations and given us some shred of dignity. But as we walked out, the stares continued, sharper now, cutting into me with quiet judgment. Brian was waiting by the door, his expression cold, his posture stiff with barely contained anger. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at us with a look of disgust that made my insides churn. "Get out," he finally said, his voice low but deadly serious. "Both of you. Now." I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, but he cut me off, his words dripping with contempt. "I don't care what got into her, or what excuse you think you have. Just get out of my house." I nodded, swallowing hard. I'm sorry, Brian. I don't know what happened. He turned away before I could finish, waving us off with a dismissive flick of his hand. The sting of rejection hit me harder than I'd expected, the final nail in the coffin of what had been a night I'd hoped would bring us closer, not drive us further apart. As we walked out, the weight of everyone's eyes followed us, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. It was as if we'd been marked, cast out for a disgrace I couldn't even begin to rationalize. We left in silence, her head slumped against my shoulder, my own mind raced. The ride home felt endless. The taxi's dull hum and the occasional streetlight flashing by were the only things keeping me from falling into a storm of rage and disbelief. My wife was draped across my lap, her head slumped against my shoulder, completely out of it. She was barely coherent, barely able to hold her own weight. I carried her out of the taxi when we finally reached the house, staggering slightly as I tried to balance her limp form while fumbling for the keys with my free hand. The moment we stepped inside, the anger I'd been holding back broke free, filling every word as I struggled to understand what had just happened. "Do you even realize what you did?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty house. She stirred, her eyes half open, but her expression was blank, vacant. "How could you lose your clothes?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why did you take them off, for God's sake? Do you have any idea what you've done?" She looked at me with the same unfocused gaze, barely even processing my words. I couldn't find my clothes," she muttered, her voice small, childlike, like it was just the most ordinary thing in the world. I stared at her, my mouth opening and closing as I tried to find the words to make her understand. But the anger was like a wall between us, growing taller and more unbreakable with each passing second. I finally shook my head, disgusted, exhausted. "Go sleep it off," I said sharply, unable to look at her any longer. We're having a serious talk in the morning." She didn't respond, just stumbled toward the bedroom with a blank stare as if nothing had happened at all. She collapsed onto the bed, and within seconds, she was asleep, breathing deeply, her face soft and peaceful. I stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling the weight of the humiliation and shame settle onto my shoulders like a leaden cloak. Once she was out, I slipped out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me as my anger flared up again. I took out my phone and immediately tried calling Brian. He didn't answer. I tried again, feeling the tension build with each unanswered ring, but he didn't pick up. The rejection hit me hard, more than I'd expected, and I cursed under my breath. Just as I was about to put the phone down, it vibrated. I checked the screen, Kevin, my assistant. I answered, and Kevin's voice came through, low and awkward. "Listen, Brian didn't want to talk to you," he started, sounding reluctant. Let's just say he's not happy. He's furious, actually. Said the whole night was ruined." I gritted my teeth, the shame flaring up all over again. "I don't know what got into her," I said, my voice raw. "She's never acted like that before." "You know she's not like that, Kevin. This isn't her." He hesitated. "I get it, man. But look, everyone saw. This is going to be one of those things people remember, you know? Brian's upset. I don't think he's going to let this go." The weight of his words crashed over me, turning my anger inward, sharpening it into a knife that twisted in my gut. Everyone would remember this. Our friends, my business partners, and Brian, who'd been there for me through thick and thin, who'd trusted me enough to invite me into his home, around his family and colleagues. I hung up, barely managing a muttered goodbye, the reality of what had happened finally sinking in. I threw my phone onto the couch, but it wasn't enough. Rage and helplessness churned inside me, a storm that needed release, and I found myself throwing anything within reach. A stack of magazines, my briefcase, a stray glass that shattered against the wall, scattering shards across the floor. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I looked at the mess, the chaos I'd created around me, feeling no relief, only a deep, suffocating shame. Everything had unraveled, and I was left standing alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a night that should have brought us closer together, but had only pulled us farther apart. I woke up the next morning with the dull ache of a headache pulsing behind my eyes, a raw reminder of last night. The anger and humiliation were still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but now mixed with a strange heaviness, a weight in my chest that refused to ease. I stumbled into the kitchen, hoping to find some moment of clarity. But there she was, sitting at the table, looking calm, as if the chaos of last night had never happened. She wasn't crying, wasn't even apologetic, just sitting there, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug, staring off into space. Seeing her like that, so composed, snapped something in me. My voice came out harsher than I'd intended, echoing in the quiet morning air. "Why did you take off your clothes yesterday?" I demanded, the words coming out in a rush. "Do you have any idea what you did? I'm ashamed of you, of both of us. What were you thinking?" She flinched at the anger in my voice, her calm exterior shattering as the shock registered on her face. She looked at me, wide-eyed, as though she was only now beginning to understand. I don't remember," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I don't remember anything, I swear. I don't even remember how I got home." I watched her carefully, searching her face for a trace of the person who'd caused all of this, the woman who'd thrown herself into the party with reckless abandon. But there was only bewilderment and a growing horror in her expression. Her hand started to shake, and she put her coffee cup down, her face turning pale. "I didn't mean to. I swear I don't remember," she murmured, her voice thickening as her eyes filled with tears. She was crying now, the tears spilling over her cheeks, but it only stoked the frustration that had been simmering inside me all night. She had no answers, no explanations, only silence and tears. The damage was done, and I was left to face the consequences, left to explain myself to people who'd once respected me, now likely thinking I was as much to blame as she was. I turned away, unable to look at her, and took out my phone, dialing Brian's number, my pulse picking up as I waited. After a few rings, he answered. I launched into an apology, my words tripping over each other as I tried to explain, to somehow make him understand that I'd had nothing to do with the spectacle she'd made of herself. Brian, listen, I'm so sorry for last night, I began, swallowing hard. I didn't know she would. He cut me off, his voice cold, clipped. I'm ashamed of both of you, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. I would never have expected something like this from you. His words came down on me like a weight, each one sharper than the last. People are going to remember this for a long time. I won't forget it. I swallowed, feeling the words catch in my throat. Brian, I don't even know what got into her. She's never acted like this before. It's okay, he said in a steely voice. I'm not angry with you because, frankly, I don't want to be angry. I'm only angry with your wife, and my wife, and I don't want her in our house anymore. The silence that followed felt thick, choking. He was my closest friend, my business partner, and to hear that disgust in his voice, no amount of apologies could change what had happened. She must have overheard, because before I could stop her, she reached out, grabbing the phone from my hand. Brian, her voice was shaky, pleading. I don't remember any of this. I don't even know what I was doing. I'm so sorry. Please. There was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, with a quiet click, he hung up. She lowered the phone slowly, her face crumpling as she realized he was gone, her words left unanswered. For a long moment, we just sat there in the silence, the weight of the night's events crashing down on us, and the fragile life we'd built suddenly seemed like it was teetering, crumbling around us. Finally, I let out a breath and sat down, my hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. I didn't have any words left, only a hollow, aching emptiness as I tried to make sense of what had happened to us. The silence between us was thick, every word from last night, and this morning hanging between us like a wound left open. She sat across from me, her face pale and tear-streaked, eyes wide and haunted as she stared down at her empty coffee cup. She looked nothing like the woman who'd staggered through Brian's house, making a spectacle out of both of us. This woman looked lost, broken, and almost as ashamed as I felt. Almost. I wanted to yell at her again, to demand answers, to make her understand what she'd done to our lives, to me, to herself. But the words wouldn't come. All I felt was an exhaustion, so deep it seemed to swallow everything else. There was no fight left in me, only the slow, sinking realization that no amount of apologies would change the way Brian, our friends, or anyone at that party would remember us. She spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know why I did it. I don't even know. I don't remember anything after that first drink. Her voice cracked, and she reached up to wipe her eyes, her hand trembling. I was just trying to have a good time. We haven't gone out in so long, and I thought it would be fun. I looked away, unable to bear the guilt in her face, and took a long, shuddering breath. A good time? I muttered bitterly. You humiliated us, made a fool out of me in front of everyone we know. Do you understand that? Do you understand what you've done? She flinched, her face falling as she nodded slowly. I do. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. It's like I wasn't even myself. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. I just wanted to feel something, and I lost control. I can't believe I did this to us. Her words barely registered. All I could think of was the looks on everyone's faces last night, the disgust in Brian's voice, the shame that I'd carry around for as long as people remembered this night, which would be a long time, longer than I could bear. After a long moment, she looked up at me, her tearful eyes searching mine, pleading. Is there any way to make this right? She asked, her voice small, broken. Can we fix this? But even as she said it, I knew she didn't believe it. And neither did I. Some things can't be fixed. Some things break too deep to ever fully heal, leaving cracks in places that can't be mended. I thought of Brian's words, his disgust, the way he'd hung up on her, on us. I shook my head slowly, each movement feeling like a final goodbye to the life we'd once had. I don't know, I said, my voice rough, hollow. I don't know if we can come back from this. She dropped her gaze, and the silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. There was nothing more to say, Nothing left to salvage. I pushed myself up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor as I stood. She didn't look up, didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, staring down at her hands, as if lost in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting alone, I realized I didn't know where to go from here, or if there was even anywhere left to go. The life we'd built felt like it had crumbled overnight, and I was left standing alone in the ruins, trying to make sense of a future that had suddenly become something I didn't recognize. I left the house, stepping out into the morning light, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on me. And as I walked away, I knew that the echoes of last night would follow me, marking a turning point I couldn't undo. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I spent the entire day outside, sitting on the worn bench in the far corner of our yard, beneath the shade of the old oak tree that had been here longer than either of us. The hours passed, the quiet settling around me, my thoughts tangled and looping in endless circles. The ache of last night still sat heavy in my chest, but out here, away from everything, the anger began to fade, replaced by a lingering sadness, an ache I couldn't shake. As I sat there, I thought about everything we'd been through, our good times, the struggles, the years we'd shared. I thought about the way she'd looked this morning, broken and ashamed, her face pale and tear-streaked, the look of someone who knew she'd gone too far. And I thought about how easy it is to make mistakes, to lose control just once, to let something spiral before you even realize what you're doing. Maybe, just maybe, this was one of those times. We all make mistakes, I told myself, feeling a small spark of resolve replace the bitterness that had consumed me since last night. Maybe this was just one stupid mistake, something we could leave behind if we both tried hard enough. If she could see the damage it had caused, if she truly understood the line she crossed, then maybe there was a way to put this behind us. With a deep breath, I pushed myself up from the bench, my decision settling into place as I made my way back toward the house. She was inside, waiting, probably just as lost in thought as I had been. As I opened the door, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes distant, staring out the window, her face a mix of regret and resignation. She turned when she heard me come in, her expression cautious, uncertain. I walked over and sat across from her, the weight of everything between us as tangible as the table itself. I've thought a lot about what happened. I began, my voice steady. And I've decided to forgive you. The words felt strange, but right. I saw her face soften, relief flooding her eyes as she held my gaze, her hands reaching across the table as if to bridge the gap between us. This can't happen again, I said firmly, holding her hands tightly. If anything like this ever happens again, we're done. I won't go through this twice. I need to know you understand that. She nodded, tears filling her eyes again as she leaned toward me. I do, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I swear to you I understand. I am so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. She squeezed my hands, then stood and pulled me into an embrace, her arms wrapping around me as if she was afraid I might vanish. I let myself melt into the hug, feeling her warmth, her gratitude. She pressed her lips to mine in a soft, tentative kiss, a promise of change, of better things to come. For the first time since last night, I felt the weight begin to lift, the tension between us beginning to fade. But not everything could be fixed so easily. In the days that followed, it became clear that some wounds wouldn't heal. Brian had cut off all contact with her entirely. At work events and gatherings, he was polite to me, even friendly, but he barely looked at her, his tone clipped and his manner distant. I tried to smooth things over with him once or twice, to explain that we were moving forward, that I hoped he could do the same, but he only nodded tightly and changed the subject. And so, a quiet wall of distance formed around her, especially whenever we were with our friends, as though last night's events had built an invisible fence between her and everyone else. She took it with grace, offering Brian respectful distance, but I could see the hurt in her eyes each time he brushed past her without so much as a word. As for us, things eventually found their balance again, and over time, the memory of that night faded, slipping into the background of our lives. We carried on, Each of us a little more careful, a little more guarded, but also a little more grateful for each other. It hadn't been an easy path, but in the end, we both knew we'd come close to losing everything. And somehow, in that closeness, we'd found each other again.